So an eagle was talking to a bat one day, telling the bat why the bat should not be happy. The eagle looked at him and he said, "But if you tasted these gnats, they're delicious." And the eagle ignored that response and he pressed his point. "Look," he says, "you're ugly. People cringe when they think of you, let alone see you. And frankly, you're an embarrassment to the rest of us who fly gracefully." And the bat thought about that for a minute and he said, "Have you tasted these mosquitoes? They're delicious too, and there's billions of them." The end. It's a terribly simplistic story, right? But the bat was not worried about how he looked. He wasn't depressed that everybody loathed him, and he wasn't scared about going without. He was too busy being satisfied. And the nature of this whole series is that's our goal. Satisfaction in God. When you achieve that satisfaction in God himself, everything else fades and everything else changes. So I've equated God to gnats, mosquitoes, and bacon now. So let's pick up on that story too. Last week I said God is like bacon and we have to develop a taste for him. And then remember how the dogs got to the bacon? They dug. And what do we equate the digging to? Well, the digging equates to your pursuit of God himself. Through the word, through prayer, through coming to things like this and talking with the guys at the table. That's you pursuing God. And what is our ultimate goal? God himself. Phil pointed out that we're not going through the books chapter by chapter. That's for you to read at your leisure. I would say that the more you read, the more what I'm telling you in these brief synopsises is going to make a lot more sense and resonate a lot quicker. Okay, I want to do a quick review of the last 2 weeks. The first week, I had 4 goals for this series. Number 1, to convince you that pursuing joy is not optional, it's commanded and even necessary for salvation. That's startling, isn't it? But let's check in with a couple verses. 1 Corinthians 16:22. If anyone has no love for the Lord, let him be accursed. It's a bit scary. Don't worry. Matthew 10:37. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. All right? I'm going to stir your thinking a little bit. That was number 1. Number 2, to convince you the best way to glorify God is through your own joy and satisfaction in him. And we discussed the difference between actions and heart. We discussed 2 Corinthians 13, which says you can do the most loving thing and not have love. And God looks at the heart, doesn't he? I want to talk about Philippians 1:20-21 because it most exemplifies this point that I'm trying to make. And Philippians 1:21 says, I will not be at all ashamed, but with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored, substitute glorified. Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. When Christ becomes the highest thing in your life, the most important soul-satisfying thing in your life, that is a broadcast to the rest of the world that says God is awesome. And I did not live that kind of life from age 16 to 50. Talked about that first week. I mentioned this third thing. To convince you the best pathway to obedience is to change your desires. And go back and read 1 John. 1 John is a bunch of imperatives, commands, but it's also a bunch of litmus tests. And one of the main litmus tests, you guys know what that is? You drop something in a piece of paper and it turns acid or base and tells you what this thing is. But the litmus test of 1 John says, if you love me, if you are radically in love with me, you will naturally do the things that I want you to do. And then I said, the other goal is to set us on a path that leads to serious joy. And our payoff verse for the whole series is Psalm 16:11. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. And we dissected that a little bit. I discussed in the first session how I spent from about age 16 when I first got saved to 50, which was 11 years ago. According to this diagram, I gutted out my Christianity, okay? I knew how a Christian was supposed to respond to the truth. So I was a believer. I knew how my outward behavior was supposed to be, and I tried to conform my behavior into what I knew a Christian should look like through a combination of sheer commitment, duty to repay, and rigid discipline. And inside this band of Christian behavior, men, are truly good things. Those things are truly good things. They are commanded, but they are not the ultimate thing. They are a means to the ultimate thing. Satisfaction in God, a heart filled with God, a heart that beats so dramatically in love with God that it produces good works. Okay. I used this to describe the point of the gospel. The point of the gospel is not to go grab people and join our club. If I said, hey, you want to come join my club? And somebody said, well, what's the point? Well, the point is to go get more members. Yeah, but what's the point of the club? Well, then that person goes and gets more members. Yeah, but what's the point? This is the point of the gospel. Each one of you reconciled to God. You were at war and separated from him, and Christ bought that peace and brought that proximity. I also made the claim that to the degree you get satisfaction in God, godly behavior results. So this thing here, this works pretty good for people with good willpower, but it's not the greatest fuel for godly behavior. When that circle on the left becomes more of who you are, connected, satisfied, in love with God, feasting off of him, then the natural outflow occurs as you see the disciples. And let's Phil talked about this in our meeting before. I can't remember what you said, Phil, but it was great. Trust me, it was great. But if you look at Paul and Silas, and when their external circumstances were at their lowest, when they were in prison, in the stocks, remember this? What did they do? They sang. Did they sit there and think, well, out of rigid discipline and sheer commitment, we're going to sing and then people might think we're spiritual? No. They sang. This was who they were, connected and joyful in God. And it said something a little bit odd for people. That God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. And we'll talk about that later. I said this: our desires are too weak, not too strong. This is a quote from C.S. Lewis. He made the point that to deny your happiness is something that's no part of the Christian faith. but we settle. We settle for far less than the infinite joy available in God. We settle for earthly stuff. We settle for satisfaction in other things. And he said, quit denying your pleasure factory, indulge it in God. We went over these two verses. Psalm 16:11. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. A couple things about this. We talked about the fullness of joy. God says that exists in one place, his presence. And is that joy just during your devotional times, just during church worship, or just this 80 or 100 years that you're on this grimy planet? No, it's forevermore. We said, my soul thirsts for God, for the living God. And I listed 11 things that are possible reasons why we might not thirst for God. Remember this slide? And in sessions 4 through 7, we'll be picking apart each one of these and resolving them to develop that thirst for God. But I ended last week talking about this exercise that I do that implements 2 Corinthians 3:18. Remember that? With unveiled face, we behold the glory of the Lord, and by doing that, we are transformed from glory to glory. And I had a little thing over here, a little diagram, and I represented God's glory with an infinity sign at the top of the page. That represented the quantity of the glory of God. And then I said, hey guys, where might you find the speech of glory in the Bible? And somebody wisely said, Psalms. We talked about Job. And I neglected to tell you that when I shifted my focus in Bible reading from looking for lists of to-dos and instead looking for the glory of God, I found it in virtually every page. Every page. And here's an example. I love reading the prophets, and Ezekiel's my favorite. He's crazy. God has him do crazy things, and he just does it because he's that in tune with God. And if you remember, in most of the prophets, they always have this introduction. I was sitting on my porch in the 10th day, I was sipping lemonade, and boom, God said, say this. And then they describe what God said. And in, I think it's the 8th chapter of Ezekiel, Ezekiel says, I was sitting somewhere, and God lifted me up by the hair and suspended me between heaven and earth. And I was tempted to blow by that. And then I said, wait a second. Wait a minute. I think Lyle and I have talked about this, my son-in-law. If Lyle Draper was lifted by God by the hair of his head and suspended between heaven and earth, I don't even know what that means. That's all we would hear about him for the rest of his life, right? You'd be at parties and talking about your fishing conquest and say, oh yeah, let me tell you what happened to me. So when you start to understand that from page 1 to the end of Revelation, it is filled with the glory of God, it's easy to start observing the glory of God. I quoted Henry Scougal, who really summarized well 2 Corinthians 3:18, that if you have a love and an affection, and you all have it, the only thing you own is your ability to love, basically, is what Scougal says. And when you direct it toward the perfect, that has a perfecting effect on your soul. Okay. But I noticed something when I was talking. And the minute I put up a slide that said, here's how I do something, I saw most of you pick up a pen and start writing them down. I'm like, duh. because I talk very flowery, and you guys are dying to know, okay, what do I need to do to go implement this? So for the rest of this talk, hopefully I'm going to intersperse it with more exercises. Okay, so let's go back through these things and plow through them in a little more detail. And this is the third week. Weeks 1, 2, and 3, we're setting the stage, kind of talking about the big ideas. And weeks 4 through 7, we're really going to get into the meat. So this is the last chance to talk about the process, okay? And review what our goals are. So to convince you that pursuing joy is not optional, is commanded, and even necessary for salvation. So Dan Sloan and I had an interesting conversation in the back of church on Sunday after service. It says, you handed that book to everybody, and it's got this weird phrase, Christian hedonism, in it. And rightly so, that raised a bunch of red flags for people. Because you don't often see those two words together, do you? So I apologize for not clarifying what that is. So let's talk about this for a minute. What is hedonism? Some people pronounce it hedonism. Well, the standard understanding biblical definition of hedonism means a life dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure. A life dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure. And when the world hears that, they think, yeah, through sex, through food, through self-focus, through leisure, through golf, porn, alcohol, everything about me, I am going to get maximum pleasure. And Christian hedonism means none of that. It means put Christian on the front of it and say, a life dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure in God. So I'll breathe a sigh of relief and say, okay, that makes more sense now. This guy's not a heretic. And notice I said God himself, not religion, not theology, but God himself. Why am I so confident about this in God thing? Why am I so convinced it's biblical? One reason is because of what God says is the opposite of Christian hedonism. And we're going to turn to Jeremiah 2, 12, and 13. So this is the prophet Jeremiah. And he is telling us the words that God gave him. That's what prophets do. Jeremiah 2, 12, and 13 goes like this. Be appalled, O heavens, at this. Be shocked. Be utterly desolate, declares the Lord. For my people have committed two evils. Stop. God is so astounded at this evil that he's talking to the entire creation. This is huge. Be appalled, O heavens. All of creation, I want you to be appalled at this. Be shocked. Be utterly desolate. I don't even know what that means, but that sounds spooky. Declares the Lord, for my people have committed two evils. What are these evils? Pride? Murder? Child sacrifice? Think of the most horrid things that we see. What are these two evils? They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. You wouldn't expect that to show up in this list, but this is an essence of evil. It is the origin of sin. Think about this. In the garden, we had it. Drinking, feasting off God himself. We're in his actual proximity. And Adam and Eve said, I'm going to exchange that. I'm going to forsake that. And Romans 1 confirms that. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the created. And what do we do in place? Try to fill it with other things. And notice the moniker that he uses. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. What is he saying? I am the source. I am life. I am everything. And you exchanged that for the created. Okay. Broken cisterns, what we attempt to fill that with, they hold no water. They lead to death and dryness, right? But what does Christian hedonism do? It produces a pleasure that is so unshakable that it causes you to do strange things, like care less about worldly possessions. Have a soul that's solid so you can withstand insults. Provides you fuel to love your enemies, to take the gospel and go die for Jesus in places like India, and to be so enwrapped that you love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you love your neighbors as yourself. That's what the opposite of Jeremiah 2:12 does. Okay, all right, get on with it, Atkinson. How do we do it? How do we get happy in God? And so here's one of the exercises I promised. And I'm going to pick on Brian Miner because if you spent more than a minute with him, you know that he's genuine. So imagine we hear the doors opening over here and Christ himself walks in. And he makes a beeline for Brian and he starts talking to him and we overhear what Christ is saying. And this is what he says. Brian, I knitted you in your mother's womb for myself and for my glory, because through me were all things created, and all things were created for me. And before there is a word on your tongue, I know it, which is a knowledge, a dynamic too high for you to attain. And you, Brian, were at war with God and separated from God and under a curse, and eternal torment in hell awaits those whose eyes have not been opened to the truth of the gospel. The cross is foolishness to them, to those who are perishing. But you turned toward me, and your veil was lifted, and you saw and believed that God made me, who knew no sin, to become your sin, so that you might become the righteousness of God. You are reconciled to God. You are at peace with God. And all of that is because of what I did. And I do all that I want, and none can stay my hand or ask me, what have I done with Brian Miner? And it was my will that no condemnation ever rest on you, and nobody can ever, ever, ever bring a charge against you, because it is God who justifies. No one can condemn you, because the trial is over, and I'm the one who died. And God is a happy God, because he has no fear, and the wrath of God has been removed from you for all time. And anything he does that is hard in your life is because you are his son. And any discipline is in no way based on God's irritation. It is exclusively for your absolute good and his glory, and neither you nor any of your family or friends or anybody in this room have enough power to comprehend the vastness of my love for you. And I and the Father are one, and none of our purposes can be thwarted. And we have said we will complete the good work we began in you. And by the way, all wrongs done to you will be righted, and all accounts brought square, and heaven is just the beginning, and you will spend eternity watching me show immeasurable riches of my grace toward you. And final thing, There are countless other promises in the Word, and all of them find their yes in me for you. So, beloved Son, come and abide and drink. Now, if Christ came and said that to each one of you, how easy would it be to be happy in God? And none of those words were Jeff Atkinson. Those words were Psalms, Isaiah, Colossians, Romans, Philippians, John, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Hebrews. I threw in some Revelation. It's all right here. And Christ has said that to each one of you. How easy it is to be happy in God. And by the way, all those things are the kingdom of God, right? All those things are the kingdom of God. And in Matthew, it says, the kingdom of heaven, it's all the kingdom of heaven, is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. And then in his rigid discipline, went and sold all he had. No. Anybody know the word there? In his joy, went and sold all that he had. All right, number 2. I wanted to convince you that God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. And we can do that right now. Here comes another exercise. And by the way, I know lots of you guys in here, and I know the desire of your heart is to glorify God. I know you. And when I say glorify God, that doesn't mean bring him something. It doesn't. And why do I know that? Because Acts 17:25 says, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. There's nothing we can do to add to his glory or enhance his glory. When you are glorifying God, you are living to broadcast his glory. Okay, that's what that means. So we all want to glorify God, and we have in our minds a way to do that. And most of what we have in our minds includes things like evangelizing and working hard at your job and raising Christian kids, all good things. But did you notice something about that list? They all had to do with outward actions, but nothing to do about the heart. And God looks at the heart. And we discussed last time, you could do these things and not have the heart, and we call those people hypocrites. You can even worship and be a hypocrite. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. We don't want that at all. And if you do something for God, like give all your money to the poor, but if it's not motivated by a changed heart, your actions mean nothing to God. That's scary. Phil's excellent sermon on Sunday alluded to the right order. And I promise you that John and Phil and I have not corroborated or coordinated these messages. But when they talked about abide, remember the order? Abide first. And that circle with us and God in it, that's abiding, isn't it? Think about this sentence again. God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. When you start thinking that, you could ask the question, well, does this depend on my ability to preach? No. Does it depend on the ability to share your faith? No. Does it depend on good works and all your kids are saved? No. Does it depend on you having a degree in theology or relationships? You can be satisfied in God sitting in that chair right now. And here's the exercise we're going to do. And don't be thrown off by this word mindfulness, because a lot of folks say, oh, that's a spooky secular psychology weird thing, mindfulness. Well, what does it mean? It's pretty easy. All it means is forget 5 minutes ago, don't worry about 2 minutes from now, and be right here. So Hallberg's sitting there in red shirt, Derek's sitting there with his legs crossed. Here we are in this physical space, okay? So that's all you got to do is be present and listen to when I say this. My brothers, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through Christ. We've been talking about this. That is happening now. Where you're sitting with any kind of inner turmoil, doesn't matter the disposition of your heart, right now, you have peace with God. And if the speaking of that phrase and me doing this weird, spooky exercise produced in you a modicum of peace, you have just glorified God. You get it? We've just done it by being satisfied, peaceful, because of this truth. All right. Last thing. To convince you that the best pathway to obedience is to change your desires. Here are some hard and true facts. Our hearts are desire factories. You cannot not want to pursue joy. You are hardwired. It is God-given that every human heart wants to pursue joy. And Pascal said it brilliantly. All men seek happiness. This is without exception. Whatever different means they employ, they all tend to this end, seeking happiness. The cause of some going to war and of others avoiding it, it's the same desire in both, attended with different views. Some want to go to war. They have the desire. Some want to avoid it. It's the same desire. I want to be happy. The will never takes the least step but to this object. This is the motive of every action of every man, even of those who hang themselves. People want to commit suicide to get happy. And you can no more change that than you could hold back the tide. Every decision you make is aimed at getting yourself happier. This is very strange. God has created desires in our hearts, right? So undeniable. And you want to glorify God. You have this desire. Don't squish it. You want to glorify God. Don't squish it. Put them together. Okay, what about the other desires? Sex, food, hunting. 1 Corinthians 10:31. So, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, including hunting, do all to the glory of God. If you have been taught that to desire your own happiness is wrong, C.S. Lewis says, that crept in from modern philosophy and it's no part of the Christian faith. So, what do I do with these desires that are not God? I'm going to challenge that phrase, not God. So, there's a description of heaven. We've seen them throughout the Bible. Can anybody name just a couple things that they know to expect in heaven? What are we going to see, or what's going to be there? Name a few things. Throw them out.
More tears.
No more tears. Great. Yeah, what are some of the objects? What are some of the things? Golden streets. Pearly gates. Okay? Is there going to be any food there? Banquet. Gold streets. Cities, right? And C.S. Lewis posed a really interesting question. He says, well, if when we get to heaven, God is going to be there, why do we need anything else? And his answer was, God is more than a person, and he has to give us those things to fully give himself. Okay, that opens up a vast field for us to talk about joy, doesn't it? All right. And I'm going to use a prime example of Lindy and B.J. Russell. So I've known these characters for a long, long time. And I have never seen two guys that were more built or designed to enjoy or experience nature. How many people know Lindy and BJ? Okay. You guys know this, right? And they get this certain giddiness in the office when it's hunting season and all the activity spirals up. And they're showing me pictures and they got maps and, BJ's bringing his various weapons of mass destruction that he's just going to go crazy with. And you can ask, why? What is God's design to build these two guys that way? And I'm going to back up all the way to Genesis 1 and remind you that God says we are created in his image. What is the point of an image? You go to a city and you see a statue of George Washington. What's the point of the image of George Washington? To glorify the original George Washington. That's the point of an image. And what is the point of you, living statue, made in the image of God? To point to the original. So how many people are on the planet right now? Anybody have any idea? Count them. 8 billion? 8 billion statues made in the image of God. The point is God. I'm borrowing from a Piper sermon now. 8 billion images. It takes everybody on the planet and more to display the full complement of God. He's that huge. And he chose these two bald guys to put this particular thing in them. It represents part of God, this ability to consume nature and just be joyful and filled up by it. So, the Russells are out there getting all giddy about hunting, and they've got this God-given desire. They've got a couple reactions, a couple different reactions, right? They could say, well, it's not really a church thing, and it's not really glorifying God because I'm not giving money to the poor, and so I'm just going to squelch that. Or they could go to the other extreme and say, I think if I could just hunt all the time, I would be filled to the full, and I'm going to sacrifice my kids and my marriage and God and just be a hunter. Or they could rightly appropriate it. And I've seen them do this. What does that mean, rightly appropriate? Acknowledge it as a particular gift, a peculiar gift. God is infinitely creative, so you are infinitely unique, right? You are displaying God in a certain way. Acknowledge it. Then follow the beam to its source. I'm almost done here. This is one last thing. Consider, this is another C.S. Lewis analogy. Consider God as the sun, the physical sun. And every gift that he's created, everything that he's created for our enjoyment is one sunbeam coming down. Hunting, food, sex, Carhartt clothes, bananas, your goofy business partner, or music and whatever else, right? And you can dwell on that gift, or you can follow it back to its source and glorify God. That's how you do it. Okay, that's very flowery. And then don't have it be a broken cistern. If you put everything in that basket, then you have an idol. Last thing, you rightly appropriate anything like that, sex, food, all these gifts, a couple things happen. You rightly follow it up to its creator. You build that connection with God. And you don't need those things as much, but they are richer.